Hi, and welcome to HRM 140, Part 3-3, Chapters 14 and 15. In this lecture, we will complete our discussion of Part 3 and our duty with regard to guests. Today, in our competencies, we're going to cover some common crimes hotels fall victim to, as well as some ways we can guard against or deal with the consequences of those crimes, and how to handle the unfortunate instance when a guest dies on property. So we start today with a situation which, if you end up in the hospitality industry, you will unfortunately but inevitably experience. Guests who don't pay. This form of theft comes in many forms, called dine and dash or beat the check, where restaurant patrons or hotel guests leave without paying, or to credit card fraud and passing bad checks. The common denominator here is that we are dealing with theft. Eating food or leaving a hotel without paying is no different in the eyes of the law than taking money from the cash register. And this commonality is hopefully what will help you understand how the law deals with these instances and how you may protect against them. First, let's be clear. We are dealing with criminal law here as opposed to civil law. Civil law deals with the disputes between individuals and organizations, in which the plaintiff is the injured party and compensation, usually monetary, is the goal. Criminal law is the body of law that deals with crime and the legal punishment of criminal offenses. In criminal law, the plaintiff is the government representing the people, and the goal is punishment of the crime. Also remember that criminal law is primarily statutory law as opposed to common law. The crimes we will deal with today can be violations of state criminal statutes or federal criminal statutes, or in some cases both. As we go along, we will categorize and discuss the differences. The first type of theft we'll talk about today is skipping or beating the check, also commonly called dine and dash. You may remember our discussion earlier in the semester about the contractual nature of eating at a restaurant. Essentially, what we have is an implied contract. You order, you are served, and you understand the responsibility to pay at the end. The basis for prosecuting these crimes comes from that understanding. In situations where a person leaves the premises without paying, the law recognizes something called a presumption. Presumptions are mechanisms that make the job of getting convictions a little bit easier. Just as in civil cases, criminal charges involve elements, called the elements of a crime. The government prosecutor must prove all of the elements of a crime in order for the charge to stand. That should sound familiar because we talked about this concept in civil law negligence. One of the elements of theft in most state statutes is the intent to steal. So think about this in the case of dine and dash. It would be nearly impossible to prosecute anyone without a presumption of intent because all they would need to say is they didn't intend to steal, they just forgot to pay. So the presumption in this case allows the prosecutor to skip over that element of intent. Now, this presumption is rebuttable, but the burden is on the defendant. So for instance, here is an oversimplified example. Let's say I'm eating in a restaurant at a hotel and I realize my wallet is in the car. I leave the restaurant to retrieve my wallet without saying anything to the staff, but before I can get to the door, security arrests me. At my trial, the prosecutor merely has to show evidence that I ate my meal and left without paying in order to meet their burden of proof and shift the burden to me. It is then up to me to prove my innocence by showing that I actually intended to pay as soon as I got my wallet. In this case, the law in most states will presume that you intended to skip out on the check if you leave the premises without paying. The next few crimes that we want to discuss also deal with payments, but shift the focus to the form of payment as opposed to just physically leaving. In these cases, we are talking about theft by defrauding a business. Let's start with passing bad checks. In the unfortunate situation where a customer pays by check and the check bounces or comes back as NSF or non-sufficient funds. Again, in this situation, the law uses the presumption mechanism. We are once again dealing with the elements of a crime and specifically the element of the intent to steal. The law recognizes a presumption that you intended to steal by using a check from an account that did not have enough funds. Again, the presumption is rebuttable, but the burden is on the defendant. Finally, let's talk about payment via credit card. Just as with checks that don't have sufficient funds, credit cards that are bounced or stolen carry a presumption. There is a major difference though. While skipping at a restaurant or passing a bad check at a hotel is usually prosecuted at the state level, when we start talking about credit cards, we are also opening up the possibility of federal criminal prosecution. The reason lies in the fact that credit cards, in one way or another, involve multiple states because of where banks, hotels, corporate offices, or customers are located. So now that we've talked about the types of crimes you may encounter, you should have a good idea that your role in making sure that prosecutors are successful revolves around the production of good evidence. When working in hospitality, one of the most important things you can do from this standpoint is ensure that you have good record-keeping processes and retention policies. Because, of course, the authorities will rely on you to produce much of the information they will submit in court to prove the elements of their case. The good news is that most, if not all, of these policies and procedures are simply a part of your normal day-to-day record-keeping responsibilities. Before we move on to the next topic, I do want to touch on the situation where you actually have the opportunity to detain a guest in some cases. This is one of those situations where keeping our hospitality hat on at the same time we're wearing our business person hat becomes incredibly difficult. Imagine this situation similar to that discussed in the illustrative case of Romansky versus Detroit Entertainment located in Chapter 14 of your text. In this situation, the hotel suspected that the guest had committed a crime and therefore detained the customer. Here we're dealing with a situation where the law recognizes the concept of shopkeeper's privilege, where a business owner is authorized to detain an individual as long as they have a reasonable suspicion that a crime has been committed. But the parameters of that privilege must be closely followed. The detention must be reasonable in length and conduct, and your state law should be studied closely before any attempts to avail yourself of this privilege are attempted. As you can see from the court-awarded damages in this case, which climbed into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, failure to utilize the privilege in the correct manner can be catastrophic. I highly recommend consulting or using a professional in any such attempt. Now that we have covered situations involving theft and fraud, I want to move on to Chapter 15 and how to handle a situation when a guest dies on property. This is a difficult situation and one that every hotel should think about and develop procedures to handle in advance. Many different areas of hospitality and law overlap when this happens. Without question, it is something that requires tact and discretion. We also need to keep in mind the health concerns, civil liability, probate and property law, and ultimately whether any foul play was involved and a criminal prosecution may result. Let's talk briefly about the health risks and guest safety. When a deceased guest is discovered, we must assume there is a health risk. To be sure, even if we don't know if there's a dangerous situation, bacteria is going to begin to grow on dead bodies almost immediately. This is something only a professional should handle, and therefore if we are sure the guest is deceased, among the first thing we should do is contact the professionals, ensure that no one enters the room. Call 911. They are equipped to handle this situation. The professionals who respond have the equipment and training to assess, handle, and secure the situation. This also ensures that professionals are handling what could be a crime scene and preserving valuable evidence. One thing that you must be cognizant of is the guest's property. It will be up to you to protect and preserve that property until it can be turned over to the deceased's next of kin or rightful owner. I hope if you have any questions about these topics, you won't hesitate to reach out to me. Until then, I hope you have a great day.